Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Liberty McCarter.
Welcome to Point of View. Thanks for being with me today. I hope that this show leaves you equipped to live out your faith, encouraged, and informed about some important things that are happening in our culture. And so to start out with some equipment, let's talk about friendship. Friendship is emphasized throughout the Bible. We know it's important. What you may not know is that according to research, spending time with friends increases your happiness as much as if you had a $133,000 raise every year. Now, I'm not just pulling that out of thin air. That's from the book FriendWise, Practical Ideas for Richer Relationships by Becky Harling, and it's what we're going to be talking about in this first half hour. Becky Harling has a degree in biblical literature. She is a speaker and Bible teacher, the host of the Connected Mom podcast, and she is passionate about helping women find hope, healing, freedom, and life transformation through Jesus Christ. Becky, thanks so much for being with us on Point of View today.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Liberty.
I love this book, and I love that it is so practical because I think a lot of people can relate to the desire to have more friends or to go deeper in the friendships that they do have. But you can find all kinds of headlines and statistics about the fact that in today's busy culture, often we just don't have that. We don't make time for it, or we struggle to find those connections. So you've obviously written a lot of different books and Bible studies. So why did you feel the need to write this study on friendship right now?
Because I think so many in our culture are lonely. You know, we're busier than ever before. We might have connections on the internet, but we're not having enough of the real, live, day-to-day, sitting across from each other, looking each other in the eye, those types of relationships. And I just felt like the Lord really wanted me to write this book to help people.
Yes, and I love that you pointed out the fact that we may be connected online, but somebody once said that, you know, the online community, which is a verbiage we hear a lot, is actually like not true. You can't really have community when you're not physically with somebody. And so this isn't just something that the U.S. Surgeon General talks about, which he has. It's not just something that maybe we want because it would make us happier. But friendships really are or should be a spiritual priority, shouldn't they?
Absolutely. You know, God has designed us to need friendships, Liberty. You know, when you think about the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they have lived in eternal friendship for forever without any conflict, without any problems. And God designed us in His image to need friends. And so we are not as healthy or as happy or as spiritually in tuned unless we have good, close friends.
And so true. And it's so important to understand why we have that need, which is because we're made in His image, like you said. So your book is so practical. There's practical things that we can implement at the end of each chapter, some reflections. It really can be like a 30-day devotional, even if people want to approach it that way, or a book study that you do with others. So we'll try to hit as many of the points as we can. But if you want to get the book for yourself, you can find the link at pointofview.net. But one of the things that you talk about right at the beginning is emphasizing intentionality in friendships. And I think this can be difficult for us. Maybe we grew up when we were kids, we were in school, or we had neighbors, and friendships just kind of happened. It seemed like they came along more easily, but we really do have to be intentional in different seasons of life to still have those meaningful relationships.
Yeah, we absolutely do. You know, in the book of Proverbs, it warns us against complacency right in the first chapter. And I think a lot of us have grown complacent in our friendships. You know, we're busy, we're running kids, you know, maybe to a million sporting events or dance or music lessons. We're trying to be successful in our careers, and all of that is good, but we've got to be intentional and make intentional time to spend with close friends. And unless we are intentional, the friendship is going to probably just kind of fall apart or gradually fade away.
Mm. And so what that is really an example of a skill. And I mentioned there are 30 chapters, but what those are 30 different skills for how to be a good friend and have good friendships. And what I really thought was a neat observation, and I didn't know this, is something about the Hebrew word for wisdom. So can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, the Hebrew word for wisdom really means a skill. It's a godly skill, and we need good godly friendship skills. You know, I've noticed that a lot of people are talking in this particular season in our culture that kids have lost their people skills, you know, because they're home from school and maybe they're on their iPads or they're on the internet and they're not spending as much time with friends. But people skills are important. Friendship skills are important. And they're part of God's design for us.
Yes. And so this is really, again, a great resource if you want to maybe equip your child, or you've got a teenager or maybe someone going off to college. And this is just not just great for anyone in any season, but to help develop those skills. And so we mentioned intentionality. And one of the things you talk about later in the book is cultivating longevity in friendship, which also requires intentionality. And we talked a minute ago about how friends, maybe in an earlier season of life, for a lot of people, they seemed like they came along more naturally. But you hear these stories of people who have been friends for decades and they've maintained friendship throughout those different seasons of life. So is there a specific skill set for maintaining friendships even when naturally they might otherwise have drifted apart?
Yeah, because we have to cultivate loyalty in our friendships. You know, as I think about some of my friendships, one of my deepest friendships is with somebody that we became friends when our kids were toddlers. Now we're both grandmothers, but we still pray together. We pray over all our grandkids, over all of our kids. I think of another friend who I met in a challenging season of life, but we have maintained our friendships throughout the years, and we've been friends for like 26 years. And I think some of the skill sets with cultivating loyalty in our friendships is to be intentional, to put the effort in. Like, even if your friend moves away, put the effort into calling. You know, don't just text. Set up strategic times where you're going to talk on the phone. Plan times where you're going to visit each other. I know for my husband and I, that's huge for us. So we will plan times to go out and be with our very dear friends who live in California for a few days, because we want to keep that friendship. We need to cultivate it over a long period of time, because the deepest friendships are loyal friends.
Yes, such great wisdom. We're talking with Becky Harling, and we're about to go to a break, but we're talking about her book, Friend-Wise: Practical Ideas for Richer Relationships, a wonderful resource to equip you with what is really the how-to for meeting a spiritual need that we have, and that is building biblical friendships. So we're going to talk with Becky some more when we get back from this break in a few minutes, so stay with us.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
James Freeman, writing in the Wall Street Journal, reminds us the great migration continues. Last year, I did a commentary on the realignment of America based on the latest census figures. James Freeman updates this and shows that the trend continues. One headline from the Houston Chronicle proclaims, "Houston suburbs are still booming, but how long will it last?" An article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram explained that the Houston metro area ranked first in numeric growth and gained 126,000 people between 2024 and 2025, and Dallas-Fort Worth grew by 123,000 people in the same time. Significant numerical growth also occurred in Austin and San Antonio. He explains that Texas may have had the biggest boomtowns, but on a percentage basis, population growth was fastest last year in the metropolitan areas of Ocala, Florida, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. People are moving from high-tax states with overly ambitious politicians to inexpensive, modest governments. However, some critics say that this migration has more to do with weather than state governments. He counters with an article from the Los Angeles Times. The city used to be one of the most dynamic boomtowns. Now Los Angeles has lost population in all but one of the last 8 years. Migration is due to several interrelated factors and is more complicated than what I describe here. You might want to get a free copy of my Point of View booklet on the realignment of America. But the major factor is money. People are making economic choices because of what governors and legislatures are doing in their state. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
All right, we're back with Becky Harling talking about her book, Friend-Wise, Practical Ideas for Richer Relationships. Would make a great 30-day Bible study, something to do with a friend, or if you want to help maintaining friendships, there are 30 practical skills that you can apply to build richer friendships. I also think it would make a great gift for a young adult or somebody that maybe you want to help them build the skill set that they need to develop those lifelong friendships. And we were just talking about really cultivating loyalty so that you can have friendships that last a long time. And Becky, you were talking about how you are intentional, even if a friend moves away, about setting up times to call, stay in touch, even travel to see friends. And again, this is a recurring theme throughout the book, but busyness competes with our friendships, as you talk about. And so a lot of people may just say, I'm so busy with my family right now, or taking care of other responsibilities. I don't know how I can maintain those friendships or how I can have time to be intentional. And so, but when you go through one of those hard seasons, it pays off. It pays off to have those friendships that you built. And I know that you write about how you have gone through difficult seasons, and one battle in particular where the friendships that you had built in your life really came through for you in an important way. So I was wondering if you could share that story.
Sure. I am a cancer survivor. So about 26 years ago, we were still very much in the thick of raising kids. And I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and had to go through a number of different surgeries. And, I always say, Liberty, that cancer is very clarifying, because prior to cancer, I was just really busy. I mean, we were in the thick of raising kids. We were in ministry. I was running, doing all the things. And as I was recovering from all the surgeries on the couch, I had the opportunity to ask the question, what is really important in my life? And I came to 3 conclusions. The first one is that obviously God is the most important. I want to nurture that relationship every way I can. My relationship with my family is hugely important still to this day. And I keep in very close contact with my kids and my grandkids. And then thirdly, I wanted to slow down enough to spend more time with my friends. And it was interesting during that season because I began to realize who were my real friends, friends who would show up for me when I was too weak to do anything. And that was a very clarifying season for me. And since that time, I've become a whole lot more intentional about maintaining those close friendships.
Wow, what a blessing to have those kinds of friends in that season. And I think that's what, if people have experienced that, then they're nodding along. And I think that's, like you said earlier, we all need that. But I want to talk about some of the things that maybe people struggle with. And again, this is why this book is so helpful, because you get very real. And so what about when you have disagreement? Because no one's going to be a perfect friend. You're going to have hurt feelings. Maybe you even disagree about politics or things like that. And so it's easy to just want to either avoid that or not want to reconcile if you had a fight, and let a drift happen when there is something that you disagree over. So what do you recommend when somebody's been in that situation?
First and foremost, you can be good friends with people and very close to them and love them and still disagree with them. Mm-hmm. You're not going to agree perfectly on everything. So we need to lay aside that expectation first and foremost. But when you're in a conflict with a friend, rather than trying to prove your point, I suggest listening to understand. Most of us, when we're in a conflict, we start talking faster. We want to prove our point. We may use more words than we normally would. I suggest that when you're in a conflict with somebody, instead of talking more, talk less. Lean in and listen. Seek to understand. Put on gentleness, pause and pray, and then repair and affirm the friendship. This is so important, rather than just backing up from a friendship because you had your feelings hurt, instead offer your friend grace and then say, you know what, this relationship is really important to me. And so I'm going to continue on and I'm going to offer grace. And you might say that to yourself. Sometimes people don't even realize they've hurt us, right? Or if your friend realizes that they've hurt you, then you can say to them, hey, this friendship is really important to me. So let's lay that aside because I want us to keep growing together in community. But conflict is a part of every relationship.
Yeah, and I really appreciate how you said we need to remove the expectation that it's not, because, there's such a movement in our culture, I think, that, and I know young people grow up hearing this, that you want to cut people off that are, that you don't agree with, or maybe that are difficult, or that you have a conflict with. And I love that you say a peacemaker initiates reconciliation, and even that act of listening can be an act of peacemaking. And another thing, though, that I really wanted to ask you about is the basis of faith as the basis for a strong friendship. And so we think about worship, we think about worshiping alongside our church family or our biological family and having, devotional and Bible study and even times of worship in those contexts. But you write about worshiping alongside a friend and actually incorporating that into your friendship. And I think maybe a lot of people aren't going to that level with their friends of really intimacy with the Lord and sharing that with a friend. So I was wondering if you could talk about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll use my friend Judy as an example. She and I have been friends since our kids were toddlers. And to be really truthful, we have lived in different parts of the world at different times, but we have maintained a close friendship. We prayed over our kids when they were toddlers. We continued to pray over them as they were teens. We prayed for their future spouses. We pray now together over all of our grandkids. And every now and then, so now we live closer near each other again, and we will take a day of prayer together, and it's such a beautiful way to spend a day with a friend. You have to be willing to be vulnerable in it, but you spend time together worshiping and praising God for who he is. And Judy and I like to do this outside. We'll go to a park and we'll just spend time praising God for who he is. And then we move into a time where we might share scriptures with each other or pray scriptures over each other that have been meaningful to us. We share places where, how can we pray for each other? What are you struggling with right now? What are your hopes and dreams? And that time before the Lord is so precious, and it strengthens your friendship like nothing else, really.
Wow, that's amazing. And what a beautiful example of that. Becky, we're almost out of time, and it's been such a privilege to talk with you. And I just thank you for this resource. And again, if anyone wants this book, you can find FriendWise at pointofview.net. We have a link to where you can go directly to get the book for yourself. And so I encourage you to check that out. But just in the last minute here, Becky, final parting words for listeners who are wanting to cultivate these kinds of friendships in their lives.
Yeah, so my final words to you would be to be intentional. Ask God to direct you to the people who are going to be close friends, and then be intentional. Bring the 3 treasures to your friendship that are mentioned in Proverbs 24, where it says, by wisdom a house is built. Well, that's also true for friendship. By wisdom a friendship is built. Through understanding it is established. So seek to understand your friend. And through knowledge, its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures. Get to know your friends and invest in them because they are a treasure.
Oh, wonderful advice. Becky, thanks so much for being with us on Point of View today.
Thank you so much for having me, Liberty.
It's been wonderful talking with you, Becky, and you can find Becky's links and information, her podcast, and again, of course, the book at pointofview.net. We're about to go to a break, but stay with us because, as I said at the beginning, I want to equip you, and I hope that you feel that way after you leave the show today. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about another book that you might want to check out called Everlasting Jesus, 40 Days of Timeless Wisdom for Modern Living by Rick Hamlin. So there's going to be some great insight there. And then in the next hour, we will talk about some issues that are relevant in the news that you might be hearing about, everything from AI and education, understanding transhumanism, and a recent episode of the No I podcast I want to tell you about. So stay with us because a lot of good things coming up right after this short break.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McCarter.
What I love about God's Word is that it is so applicable to today. Times may change, the particular issues that we're dealing with or that we have going on in our particular country or area where we live might change over time, but who we are as human beings doesn't change. And most importantly, God doesn't change. And so Rick Hamlin is my guest. He has brought that wisdom and that truth to this book, Everlasting Jesus, which is very approachable, a really nice read. And so, Rick, thank you so much for being with us on Point of View today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yes, it's great to have you. Let me just introduce you a little bit. You're the author of numerous books, including Finding God on the Train, a Book of the Month alternate selection, as well as 10 Prayers You Can't Live Without and Pray for Me. And you've served on the staff of Guidepost. And so, again, you've written in many publications about faith. And so I want to just, first of all, before we dive into some of the chapters and the issues that you talk about in particular, why was this book on your heart to bring the timeless truth of God's Word to people today?
Well, it was because I needed the help myself. I didn't put this in the book, but I had just gone through open heart surgery, which is a pretty difficult thing. And, doctors can fix you up and, you start recovering physically. But I know I needed to recover emotionally and spiritually. And so I thought, oh, boy, I need Jesus now. And started spending time with Jesus. Wow,
that's a wonderful testimony. And one of the things that you talk about in your, I'm just going to jump to this question. I loved it. You titled your chapter, I think, Hang Out with Jesus. And what we're seeing is, we talk about this on the show a lot, there are different trends and headlines and polling that show that a lot of young people today are expressing more of an interest in religion and in faith. But you really just have to spend time with Jesus. And I think that's so important for people to understand. So talk more about what that looks like.
Well, it's interesting, Jesus didn't leave a building. He didn't leave a constitution. He didn't leave, a structure. Okay, you're going to be the head, and when you're gone, it's going to be to you and you and you. And he didn't even write anything down. I mean, we have the Gospels that were written years, maybe 30 years after his death by people who remembered him. But what we get from Jesus is, remember how he says, he tells the disciples, go out two by two, that, to be people of faith, we need to do it with each other. And that's why we go to church. I was thinking, where two or more are gathered on Zoom, there I am, Jesus must have said. It's to be with each other with Jesus is a blessing.
That's a really good insight, and it is actually so perfect because just a few minutes ago I was interviewing Becky Harling on her book Friendwise, which is all about cultivating and nourishing biblical friendships, because she said, as image bearers of God, we are made in his image. We need relationship. And so that's just such a beautiful connection that we can grow closer to Jesus when we're walking in that community. But let's talk about one of the parables that you highlight in one of your chapters. And I wanted to talk about this because it's always stuck with me. And that is the parable of the workers. And Jesus is telling the story of how you have people who come in the early in the morning, and then a little bit later in the day, and then some people who come in really late in the day. And at the end, the master pays them all the same. And of course, the workers who get there earlier are saying that's unfair. And when I was younger, even as a kid, I remember reading that and I agree, that is unfair because they didn't do as much work. And I think a lot of people in our culture today would see that or see things like that as unfair. I mean, all around us, it's, that's not fair. You're canceled. No forgiveness for that. There's just not a lot of grace in our culture. But I really liked how you handled that story, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
It's so funny now. I can't remember exactly what I wrote about it, but what I think about right now when we retell that story is, I would have been one of those people right there at the beginning. That's me. I show up on time. I do the job. And, just like you, I go, oh, well, that's not fair. Why, everybody gets, after all, what they were promised. But more importantly, I think those of us who can be there first, well, we had a lot of benefits. We probably had a safe place to live, had a good meal, had a good night's sleep, so we show up right on time for work. And sometimes the people who come in late, they haven't had the blessings that we've had. And so I think it's important for us to know that God's grace extends to all of us, the first and the last, verse in Jesus' realm.
Yeah, yeah, such a good word for us, and something to remember as well as we extend that grace. And another parable too that is a little bit similar in terms of just being there first and wanting to do things the right way. That's how the oldest son feels in the story of the prodigal son. And so you have a chapter on that. And what I really love is you titled that chapter, Everyone Counts. And so if you are in the shoes of the younger son who goes on the wayward journey and then returns, maybe you feel like you don't matter as much to God. Or even if you haven't had that dramatic of a story, our culture idolizes success. You've got the 30 under 30 list every year. You've got influencers, the pressure to do something big. And maybe people can feel like, well, gosh, if I'm not going to do anything radical, then maybe God doesn't have any use for me. And so, but you really kind of turned that notion on its head in that chapter.
Well, I guess, every time I look at the prodigal son, I know I would have been the son who stuck around and did everything. And the danger of that is there can be a certain self-righteous tone. Remember, the father loves both of them, and he's always celebrated the one who stuck around, and now it's a chance to celebrate the one who returns, who's gone through some terrible stuff. So it's, when you hear Jesus' parables, it's a chance to leap into the story and look at yourself and go, wait, who am I? And figure out who you identify with, and maybe there's a lesson there. And I think, for those of us who do the right things, the danger is that we can be sort of self-congratulatory and I'm afraid judgmental rather than loving. God is love, and Jesus is the embodiment of love. He's always showing us that.
Yeah, so good. One of the things that you talk about in another chapter is do good, if necessary, let others know. And you talked about patting ourselves on the back for all the good things that we do. But you also note that sometimes Jesus healed individuals and he said, don't share, don't tell anybody about that. Obviously, Jesus is God, and so he gets the glory from us. But when he was in his earthly ministry, he wasn't about broadcasting every single miracle, every single act of ministry that he did. And so how do you think we can apply that to our lives?
It's such an interesting thing. You see, and he's done some amazing thing. And then, he's healed somebody and then he says, well, don't tell anybody. Don't, just go back to your community. In some cases, go tell the priest. And I think part of it is that if we, start telling the story, we end up being the story rather than experience the healing. Sometimes we just need to experience it, just feel the beauty of it, not just broadcasting, the miracle that Jesus, look at me, the miracle that Jesus did. It's sometimes more valuable to just treasure it deep inside. That Jesus had those moments where he needed to really be by himself. Maybe after something like that happens, we need to be alone so we can treasure it and treasure our Jesus time.
That's so good. I was just talking with Steve, our producer, before the show. We're in a time in our culture where we say pick or it didn't happen. And there's another term, hyper reality, where the things that are online actually seem more real to us than the real world. And I think that's where we get a lot of that pressure of I've got to share this so that it is legitimate. But that is such a wise word and a timely word, I think, for us to often just allow that time to treasure that. The Bible says that Mary, Jesus' mother, she treasured these things in her heart. And it doesn't always have to be public. It doesn't always have to be a big story where we're at the center. Sometimes we just need to value that time with the Lord, like Rick is saying. So we're talking with Rick Hamlin and about to go to a break, but we are talking about his book, Everlasting Jesus. If you want to get more information about Rick, you can find that at pointofview.net, and stay with us because we will be back with more in this conversation after this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few minutes with Rick Hamlin talking about his book, Everlasting Jesus. And Rick, we live in a world that is so overwhelmed with information, often the kind that induces worry and anxiety, and even our social media algorithms feed into this. One thing I've noticed is that as a mom of young kids, if I get on Instagram or something like that, and I start scrolling, almost immediately I will be shown stories that are very scary that have to do with, these horrible things happening that really play on my fears as a mom. And that's just the dark reality of where we are, of how a lot of the devices and the technologies that we use work. And yet Jesus speaks to this because anxiety and worry are not new problems. So you write about this in the book. And I just think it's something that is super relevant for people today.
Well, yeah, I remember he says that famous thing, worry not. One year, my wife, Carol, gave up. She decided, okay, she would give up worry for Lent. That would be her Lenten discipline. And of course, our two then college-age son, both decided to go to Mexico on these crazy trips. So, she's given something even harder to worry, not to worry about. But here's what I think we have to watch out for, is we can confuse work with worry. We think, if I'm worrying about it, I'm getting myself ready, and then I can remember all those things I need to do. I mean, every morning I give myself, I'm lucky, a half an hour of prayer, contemplative prayer. But in that period, things just dodge into my head. But, worry is not work. We're just by worrying about something and we get it done. That's not the way to live. And Jesus is showing us, consider the lilies of the field, the birds of the air. The birds of the air, they work hard, but they don't worry. And that's who we can be. And so we give ourselves, Jesus is trying to help us in this world. I mean, he knows exactly how that distracting, all those things that come up on social media can be, screaming at us.
Yeah.
Here's one of my disciplines: is before I read the news, I try to read the good news. I read a chapter or two of the Gospels. I read a psalm or something, and it's just to put the news in perspective. I need the good news before I get into the news.
That's so wise. And I wanted to ask you about that as well, because you do have a chapter on following Scripture carefully and judiciously. And not only does that help us overcome worry and anxiety and the fears that are literally notifying us when we wake up in the morning if we don't turn our notifications off on our phone, which here's a tip. You should do that for anyone listening. But, we also are, in a time where a lot of people aren't studying the Bible on their own. And so it can be hard to know or discern when maybe God's word might even be misused or misapplied or taken out of context. And that can be a real concern for people. But Jesus himself was very well versed in the Scriptures, wasn't he?
Yeah, he did. In the Hebrew Bible, he quotes, and I think in that chapter I quoted that when Jesus is tempted in the desert, the devil uses Scripture to argue with him, and the devil's not looking for good things. So it's not just the words of Scripture; it's the message beneath that's really important. And Scripture is a joy and a rich, satisfying thing to to just immerse yourself in. But be careful if somebody's trying to manipulate, this verse or that verse. No. Underline. Remember, Jesus is bringing love into the world, and that's who we need to connect with. Love your enemies, after all, he said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's so hard. And I actually wanted to ask you about that next, because we do live in such a segmented world or culture, and it's very easy for us to get caught in an echo chamber and just identify with our group, our comfort zone, and everybody else is the enemy. And yet the Bible challenges us to not think that way. You say that Jesus challenged groupthink of his time. And when we're reading about the scriptures, or we're reading, Jesus, and we're reading the Gospels, we may think, oh, that's all just Bible times, and we just kind of lump it together. But in reality, he was really breaking down a lot of barriers that existed then, wasn't he?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he did things that, shocked you. He goes and talks to the Samaritan woman. He shouldn't be talking to a woman and a Samaritan woman. I mean, he's reaching out to her, not just the inside crowd. And I think that's a model for us, is to be open, to look beyond just our little, bubble universe.
Yeah.
One of the stories I often reminded, this is a family story about love your enemies. My grandfather just hated FDR, and he thought, Eleanor Roosevelt was hideous. Oh, yeah. He was a rabid Republican. But he ended up sitting on an airplane next to Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, my goodness.
And he came away and said, oh, she's a beautiful woman. She's lovely. I mean, he didn't change his political alignment, but he met somebody who was interested in him, and he saw the goodness of her that you lose when you're just labeling everybody. Let's look for the goodness inside of people.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting story. And you really can't do that if you're not spending time with people and face to face. And Jesus did, he set that example. And that's kind of what you mentioned a few minutes ago, is that when we what we're called to do as Christians is spend time in community, not make sure that you find community that aligns with you perfectly in every single way, but being around other people, and that brings us closer to the Lord. Another thing, though, that I wanted to ask you about before we run out of time is this concept of losing yourself to find yourself. And finding oneself is something that, we hear a lot in culture today. And yet, if we try too hard to figure out what our identity is, then we'll miss it, won't we?
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that a mysterious thing? Lose yourself to find yourself? The one who loses himself finds himself. For me, the spiritual practice of contemplative prayer is losing myself. I'm letting things go. I'm letting God handle them. But, instead of thinking, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, cross that off, cross this off. Just there's a time every day that I'm trying to make of letting things go. And sometimes other people find you in ways that you never could have guessed at.
Yeah, so good. Rick, we are out of time, but it has been wonderful talking with you. Thanks so much for joining us on Point of View today.
Thank you. You're a much better reader than I am.
Well, I appreciated the book, and if you want to get a copy of it, you can find links we have at pointofview.net for Everlasting Jesus. We're about to go to a break, but when we come back, another interview, and this time we're going to talk about an unconventional trend that is spreading, and that is the issue of artificial intelligence in schools, not just being used in education in the classroom, but AI actually replacing teachers. There is a whole movement of schools called alpha schools, and we're going to talk with an expert who is going to maybe give us some perspective on what we should think about this and how we should approach education from a Christian perspective. We'll discuss more issues in the next hour as well, so make sure that you don't go anywhere. Stay with us right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Liberty McCarthy.
Let's talk about AI in education. If you receive our Outlook magazines, which we send to monthly supporters of Point of View, then you will notice in a couple of months coming up in June that we have another issue coming out on artificial intelligence, and I have an article in that issue on AI in education. But this is something that we need to talk about now, because if you haven't heard the news, this was reported in Fox News recently that a unconventional private school is going to expand dramatically come the fall. So there will be new campuses in Chicago, Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh, California, and this is called Alpha School. And so what it does is actually replace human instructors with artificial intelligence. This isn't the only example, though. We'll get into some more examples of how artificial intelligence is encroaching into the classroom. And Sheri Few, who is the founder and president of U.S. Parents Involved in Education, says maybe we should think about this a little bit before we rush to adopt the latest, greatest technology into our classrooms. So, as I mentioned, Sheri Few is the founder of president of United States Parents Involved in Education. She is a nationally recognized leader on educational policy, also the host of the Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few podcast. So, Sheri, welcome to Point of View.
Well, thank you, Liberty. I appreciate you having me on the show. And I love your first name. How in the world did you get blessed with such a wonderful first name?
Oh, well, thank you. I will give a shout out to my parents because, well, they actually just liked the name. And when they got married, they planned to use it someday. And then when they got pregnant, they heard that their due date was going to be July 4th. And so they decided it was a good time to use that name. I was born on July 11th.
Awesome.
I was born a little bit late. So you can, anyone listening, feel free to send me a birthday card on 7-Eleven. But just kidding. But yeah, that's the story behind the name. But let's talk about this issue, though, because we really are seeing a lot of incentive to adopt AI and technology. First Lady Melania Trump even showcased a humanoid robot at a White House event not too long ago, saying, hey, this is going to be great for future students to have robot tutors. But as Christians and parents, how should we think about this?
We should put the brakes on and think deeply about this, because it's a big mistake, and there's lots of evidence that supports that. So the story, about the Alpha schools is really alarming, and we can get into that. But first, let's just talk about technology in general, and now AI, its influence on children's learning. So one of the things I like to talk about is that the Waldorf School, which is in the Silicon Valley, where all the big tech executives send their kids to school, has zero technology in grades K through 8. So there's no technology in the classroom, no computers, no whiteboards, none of that. So they are the tech execs. They know better than anyone, and this is how they are educating their children. Whereas on the flip side, with this new Alpha School program, they're pushing what they call adaptive learning, and that's something that, or it's also referred to as personalized learning, and even competency-based education was real popular about 3 or 4 years ago. And so that's the whole idea of a child learning directly from a computer. So all of their learning is happening on a computer. The program is adaptive, meaning that as the child answers questions on the screen, it moves them on if they answer correctly. If not, they have to go over and over and keep repeating that until they get the correct answer and then move on. So if it's not obvious what the problems are with that, it's that, there's no incentive for a child to prepare and learn and retain information. It's just a matter of click and move on to the next standard. So that's an obvious issue, and something that our organization, the United States Parents Involved in Education, we've been very concerned about since its inception. And basically government schools have already morphed into digital-based learning centers. This is what's happening in nearly every classroom. And, we used to warn teachers, look, your job is in jeopardy. They want to replace you. They can hire babysitters to sit in the classroom with computers and make sure children are moving on from one program to the other. So, that's probably why the teachers unions and some on the left are very concerned about these alpha schools. And, I never thought I would agree with the unions, but one of them was quoted as saying, let's see, I got that quote here somewhere. Human teachers are vital for emotional support and problem-solving skills that technology cannot replicate. Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that 100%. Mm-hmm. And so it's a shame that people don't understand how important that personal touch of a teacher in the classroom interacting with a student, how important that is to children.
Yeah, so true. I know that your organization, and as someone who is homeschooled and is homeschooling my own kids myself, we encourage parents to be involved in their kids' education. And probably a lot of people never thought, well, you said that you saw this coming, that we would have to argue just for any human, period, to be involved in your kids' education, not a robot. But we're going to go to a break in just a couple of minutes, but maybe give us a little preview here. What about the people who say, well, we need to be putting this in the classroom now, otherwise our kids aren't going to be prepared for the future?
Okay. So, I can tell you again the example with the tech executives. They know better than anybody what children need as far as being prepared for the future. And, we kind of follow that model as far as our recommendation. Our organization does not recommend that there's any technology K through 8. Now, you can introduce it, and obviously they're going to experience it at home, and parents need to be vigilant about, how much screen time they have. Screen time is a huge issue. I remember just a few years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics had a warning for parents to limit their children's screen time to 2 hours a day. Well, now they've changed that. They've changed the wording to say you're at home screen time, because they know all day long the kids are on the computers.
Yeah, absolutely. The ed tech is such a big issue, and we were about to go to a break, but we'll discuss more with Sheri when we get back. But just a note on ed tech, for people who aren't aware, there is so much research coming out now where they're saying, oops, we made everybody implement this, a decade ago or more, but it actually didn't help learning. It didn't help achievement, especially in the United States. Children are still achieving at all-time lows with regard to their academics. So why would we think that the latest, greatest tech that has so much money behind it, trillions of dollars in investment that everyone is pushing, is automatically going to solve all of our educational problems. So when we come back, I want to ask Sheri a few more things, specifically how we should think about schools like these alpha schools, how we should respond maybe if you have a child in school and all of a sudden they're pushing these AI tools, and maybe even what homeschoolers should think. Can we use this technology in our education at all? Do we just stay away from it? And what do we need to understand about education? So we'll discuss that when we get back from this short break. Don't go anywhere.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
James Freeman, writing in the Wall Street Journal, reminds us the great migration continues. Last year, I did a commentary on the realignment of America based on the latest census figures. James Freeman updates this and shows that the trend continues. One headline from the Houston Chronicle proclaims, Houston suburbs are still booming, but how long will it last? An article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram explained that the Houston metro area ranked first in numeric growth and gained 126,000 people between 2024 and 2025, and Dallas-Fort Worth grew by 123,000 people in the same time. Significant numerical growth also occurred in Austin and San Antonio. He explains that Texas may have had the biggest boomtowns, but on a percentage basis, population growth was fastest last year in the metropolitan areas of Ocala, Florida, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. People are moving from high-tax states with overly ambitious politicians to inexpensive, modest governments. However, some critics say that this migration has more to do with weather than state governments. He counters with an article from the Los Angeles Times. The city used to be one of the most dynamic boomtowns. Now Los Angeles has lost population in all but one of the last 8 years. Migration is due to several interrelated factors and is more complicated than what I describe here. You might want to get a free copy of my point of view booklet on the realignment of America. But the major factor is money. People are making economic choices because of what governors and legislatures are doing in their state. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back with Sheri Few, and if you want to learn more about her organization, which empowers parents to be involved in their children's education, and her podcast, you can find links to all of that at pointofview.net. And we were talking about the alpha schools and how they are growing, and in general, you really see a lot of push and incentive for schools to include AI into their classrooms. So, Sheri, I know you talked about how the tech executives themselves do not send their kids to these kinds of schools. They send their kids to schools with 0 screens, which I think is so important for people to understand. But one of the claims of alpha schools is that their students learn twice as fast as those in standard schools, meaning with human teachers. And so this claim just seems so odd to me, that they would say their students learn twice as fast. It makes me wonder how they're really defining learning. But what's your response to that?
Well, I'm with you on that. When I read that in the article, not only are they twice as fast, but they're scoring a median score of 1530 in their graduating class and 1410 in the freshman class on the SAT. And if you're familiar with SAT, a perfect score is 1600, and it takes very, very bright children. I had 4 children. 2 of them scored real high. The other ones not so much, but they just have different gifts and abilities. And so it takes a very, very bright child to score that highly on an SAT. I just question those claims. I just don't see how in the world that's happening, because they're also claiming that they only have instruction for 2 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And so while, homeschool parents understand that it doesn't take 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to educate your children, still a minimum of 2 hours a day in a classroom setting, it doesn't seem that you'd be able to teach the child all that they need to learn to score like that on the SAT.
Yes, and this is probably something else we should talk about on Point of View another day, but just real quickly with regard to the SAT, there are a lot of problems with standardized testing in general. In fact, I think they recently made a change where instead of a longer passage for their reading comprehension section, it was like 45 words, like one sentence, and it used to ask students to really kind of analyze from a literary perspective a passage of literature and understand what was implied there. Now they literally include one sentence and ask students to restate the fact that was stated in that one sentence, and that's reading comprehension. So you can, we've all done it. We've all crammed for a test and, memorized a bunch of stuff real fast and done a brain dump. And that's not the same as actually learning and truly being educated. And I wonder if that's, kind of maybe how they're getting some of these numbers and these scores. But for parents who maybe they're not homeschooling, they have kids in public school or maybe even private school. I've heard a lot of private schools who are arguing that they need to keep up and adopt AI into their classroom. Is there any way that parents can feel equipped to push back if this issue comes up where their kids are in school?
Well, absolutely. I mean, parents do need to push back. There are so many nefarious things happening in government schools today. Our organization doesn't recommend any parent enroll their child in government schools. We actually just issued a report a few months ago titled, "Are Government Schools Redeemable?" And as you can imagine, the findings were not good. And we list 5 major issues that are roadblocks to any short-term remedy for the government school system. It's a very convoluted system. It's tied to the colleges of education, which we know are extremely liberal. They're the ones training the teachers for the classroom. And then you've got the unions. There's just so much that's happening. It's not something you can surmount easily. So that's the reason we don't recommend parents put their children in government schools. But the points you made about the SAT, I think, are important. And I do know that the College Board was taken over about 10 or 12 years ago by this same gentleman who wrote the Common Core standards, which were just a horrible thing that was pushed on states by the federal government. They're actually still in place. It's another one of the myriad of problems that we have in government schools. So it would make sense, perhaps, that is why these students are achieving such high SAT scores in this Alpha school, if the standard is so low as you just described. And it doesn't surprise me, because I knew back then they were aligning the SAT with the Common Core standards. And so, yeah, as far as parents pushing back on screen time, parents who believe that, they have no other option but to enroll their children in government schools. And I even would say, they might want to pray about that and see if there aren't some alternatives for them. But nonetheless, those who do want to try to fight, and I used to say, I care about all the kids, not just my own. I don't want the government indoctrinating my entire community of children. So that's why even, just voters and American patriots and Christians, should speak up at their school board meetings and push back on these type ideas. And, it's just become so overwhelming that I was so pleased to learn recently in the news, and you kind of alluded to this, so maybe you've read the same article where Dr. Horvath, who is a neuroscientist, he studies brain development, and he was on C-SPAN in January talking about how Gen Z has the lowest has a lower cognitive development rate than the generation previous. And he said they're the first generation that hasn't been wiser. And he points directly to the push for technology in the classroom. And he said, we've spent billions of dollars on this, again, pushed into the classrooms by people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, which obviously stood to make tons of money off this. If you can imagine, prior to every child having a laptop or a Chromebook in the classroom, that was a big price tag for these tech giants. And so pushed in with their, lots of money to influence the schools to buy their technology. And then we end up with a neuroscientist saying, look, we need to rethink this. And the other thing that's egregious to taxpayers is look at all the money we have dumped into this, only to learn that it may be hurting our children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so important to know and to understand where the incentives really lie, which, as you pointed out, of course, the tech companies that were selling, millions and millions of these devices to schools and states across the nation. I mean, they made a ton of money off of that. And so there was so much money invested into ed tech that they had to push it out there. But I'm really glad you brought up that interview specifically, because I did see that headline, and there is other news coming out, and we cover it on Point of View, and I'm sure you talk about it as well, Sheri. So there are resources for people who want to be able to cite statistics and say, look at what works for kids' education and look at what doesn't, and they can be empowered in that way. But we're almost out of time. But Sheri, just tell us a little bit more about your organization and the resources that you have available that people can check out.
Okay, so we're a national nonprofit organization, United States Parents Involved in Education. Our website is USPIE, that's USPI.org, and we have a lot of good resources there. You can find a link to our weekly podcast, which is titled Unmasking Government Schools. We have some wonderful experts that I have the privilege of interviewing, and there's just a lot of good information for parents to follow, whether you're homeschooling or not. And as I mentioned, even adults, patriots, Christians, taxpayers, they need to be aware of the indoctrination happening in government schools on their dime. And if we don't stop it, we could lose our very freedom in this country. It is that important.
Absolutely. Well said, Sheri. Thanks so much for joining us on Point of View today.
All right. Thanks for having me, Liberty.
So we're about to go to a break, but when we come back, we're not done talking about how we can protect kids. And Sheri is so right. We need to care about our communities. We need to care about what's happening in the public school system. And we need to care about what's happening in the court system. And so, as you probably know, just last month in March, I think we talked about it here on the show, a jury in Los Angeles found Meta and Google liable in a landmark case where jurors determined that those companies of Instagram and YouTube were actually needing to be held accountable for addicting and harming young people. And this is not the only case of its kind. There was another similar case in New Mexico where a jury found a similar result. And we are seeing thousands of these cases pop up. And if you are wondering, is this a good thing or is this a threat to free speech, as some have argued? Well, let's look at the evidence, and I have an article linked for you at the website, and we're going to go through some of that evidence in just a few minutes, so stay with us right here on Point of View.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McCarter.
Should social media companies and big tech companies like Meta, YouTube, or Google, which owns YouTube, should those companies be held accountable for the harm done to individuals, especially minors, who use those platforms? That is the question at the center of a lot of recent civil cases that we're seeing. We've reported on some of them on Point of View. I talked about that just a minute ago, but just to review, the first one was in March in Los Angeles, and a jury actually found Meta and Google liable for the jurors determining that the parent companies of Instagram and YouTube had acted with malice, oppression, or fraud, addicting and harming the young plaintiff. And then just around the same time, a jury in New Mexico found Meta liable for misleading consumers about the safety of its platforms and endangering children. Now, a lot of headlines, especially from people who really have been researching this issue of tech and social media and the safety for kids involved in all of those platforms and devices, they were celebrating these decisions. And if you follow any of those people, any of those researchers, they are saying more are coming. Like, this is going to continue to be an issue. Big tech companies are finally being held accountable. But there has been some pushback. I remember when the jury released its decision in these cases, there was pushback from conservatives. I know specifically in the Wall Street Journal, their editorial page and the editorial page of the National Review both critiqued these decisions, saying that they were a threat to free speech. Basically, that we should not hold platforms accountable for the content on those platforms. Now, what's important to know is that these cases were not brought on the basis of the content that was available on the platforms of, say, Instagram or Facebook or YouTube. It was something that I think the critics maybe just dismiss as a loophole, but is actually very important. It was not a violation of Section 230 or 203, which allows free speech over media. And of course, we all are concerned about censorship on social media, and as conservatives, we've seen that happen. So we don't want that to be happening. We don't want content on platforms to be censored, or companies like Meta to feel pressured from the government to delete certain kinds of content, which happened under the Biden administration. But this was different. These lawsuits were actually targeting the way that these platforms were designed to work. So this essay that we have posted for you on pointofview.net gives you all of the evidence in favor of the plaintiffs that are bringing these cases against the social media platforms. So one of the authors of this essay is Jonathan Haidt. So you may have heard his name. We've talked about him on Point of View. He's the author of The Anxious Generation, and he does a lot of really important research. So if you look at this essay, it's actually posted on his Substack blog. So I would encourage you to follow that because he's writing on there all the time in between when he's publishing books. So this is actually kind of a shortened version of an essay that he and a co-author wrote for the World Happiness Report, which is an annual report where researchers show how various countries are measuring in terms of well-being. And there is usually a topic focus each year in the World Happiness Report. So for the 2026 report, the focus was on social media. Jonathan Haidt and his co-author here, Zach Rausch, were asked to write the main essay on that. And so what they did in their essay was basically say, we're going to lay out a hypothetical case similar to the cases that have been already made and the trials that have already, the jury trials that have already decided in favor of these plaintiffs against the social media companies. And we are going to lay out 7 lines of evidence, including what the victims say, what eyewitnesses say, what company insiders say, different kinds of studies, different bodies of research, cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, randomized controlled trials of social media time reduction. So any type of evidence that you would want to see is included in this essay, and it's about 8 pages when you print it out, so it's not short. But if you don't want to read through all of the legal documents that are in these cases and you want to maybe sit down for 30 minutes and get a better understanding of this issue, this is a great resource. Because when the companies are preparing their defense, what they're basically saying is blaming other people, saying, well, you opened the account too young to the plaintiff. You shouldn't have opened it when you were, 12 instead of 13, which is when we say you should open the account, or it's your parents' fault for allowing you to get addicted, or all of this research showing that depression and anxiety among adolescents spiked whenever everybody got smartphones and social media. That's just correlation. It's not actually causation. So basically, those are the arguments that this essay is compiling evidence against. So let's go through some of the evidence. And again, probably won't have time to cover all of it, but I encourage you to check out the essay for yourself. It's one of those resources it's good to have on hand. But line 1, what the victims have to say. So you always start here with this kind of personal testimony in this hypothetical case that they're laying out. And this is, it's a hypothetical case that they're laying out for us, showing how they would demonstrate this in court, but all pulled from real research that they have done. So when you are talking to young people who use social media, and as we talked about with Sheri a minute ago, Gen Z has been raised on screens. They describe widespread experiences of cyberbullying, sexual exploitation, sleep disruption, lower confidence, and worse mental health. There was a Harris Poll study of Gen Z where nearly half reported that they wish that TikTok, X, which used to be called Twitter, and Snapchat were never invented, even though they use those platforms for hours a day. Internal surveys conducted by Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook, found similar results. Their own research found that teens blame Instagram for increasing their rates of anxiety and depression. So even the research done by the parent companies are finding these lines of evidence from the victims themselves. So one of the things they say in their essay here is that in a courtroom, it's very powerful when a victim points to someone and says, he did it. And that's basically what these plaintiffs are doing with the social media companies. But you can't just rely on what a victim says. You have to look at other forms of evidence. So the next one they go to is eyewitness accounts, basically looking at, okay, what about the people who are around these adolescents? They are observing the changes, parents, teachers, others who work with kids. So a 2025 Pew survey of U.S. teens and their parents found that 44% of parents identified social media as the single most negative influence on teen mental health. If you are a parent of teens or a grandparent, or young people who are on these devices a lot and on these platforms, you might be nodding your head and saying, yeah, I've observed similar things. So also there's, books that we talk about where teachers report a drastic difference when all of their students started having social media or started having smartphones, when they compared that to a time when they were teaching and that wasn't the norm. It's a very noticeable difference. But here's where I think some of the most damning evidence lies. And I'm not even getting into the actual studies and statistics and the different kinds of research that show causation versus just correlation with these platforms and teen mental health. But let's talk about basically there are hundreds of text messages, internal emails, messages, memos from the people working at places like Meta and Google and Snapchat. Okay, so here's a chat between 2 Meta researchers that is quoted in this article. Oh my gosh, Instagram is a drug. We're basically pushers. We are causing reward deficit disorder because people are binging on Instagram so much that they can't feel reward anymore. What that is referencing is the system in our brain, which releases dopamine to incentivize us to do something again that is pleasurable so that we get that internal dopamine reward. Well, what this person is saying, who's actually a researcher at Meta, was saying that Instagram was taking advantage of that to such an extent that it was causing users to not be able to feel pleasure in everyday life. And we see this, we've already seen this from researchers over and over again. People are getting addicted to it because of the dopamine reward. So here is another quote from a member of Meta's core data science team. There are reasons to worry about self-control and use of our products. And so they presented evidence. This was in an internal presentation. They found that a 1-month break from Facebook improved self-reported well-being. And here's what the member of that team said. I worry that driving sessions incentivizes us to make our product more addictive without providing much more value. So basically, all of these systems that they put in place to try to keep people on their platforms and their programs as long as possible are causing harm. This is from Snapchat. And if you know any teens or young kids, high chance that they're on Snapchat. Around 10,000 user reports of sextortion each month. And that 10K monthly reports likely represents a small fraction of this abuse, as this is an embarrassing issue that is not easy to categorize in reporting. That was from a member of Snapchat's own team. So if that itself doesn't give you a clue into whether or not these companies are responsible for the harm that they have caused to many young adults, well, I don't know what will. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we get back after this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
So just to round out what I was sharing a minute ago about the 7 lines of evidence against social media and big tech companies, basically you need to check out this essay because, as I said, there's not time to go through all of it. But if you want to maybe push back a little bit against anyone who says there's no evidence that these tech companies themselves are actually cause harm or that their products cause harm, then, or maybe that, all of the evidence that teens have higher rates of anxiety and depression today, that all of that is just, correlational. It's not actually causational. Show them this essay because there's just as much evidence and research packed in here as you could want. So to just kind of sum it up again, this is written by Jonathan Haidt and a co-author as well. Our 7 lines of evidence make it clear the answer to the product safety question is no. In other words, are these products safe? No. Social media platforms are not safe for young people. These consumer products were designed intentionally to maximize the number of children and adolescents who would be drawn to them and the amount of time that each would spend on them. The leaders and researchers at these companies know, again, we just read their quotes. They knew this when they were designing these products. They know that heavy users of social media suffer many indirect harms and that even light users are often exposed to dangerous direct harms. And yet they continue to push their products anyways. So we will continue to see this issue. We'll see more civil cases like the ones that we've already seen litigated, both in California and in New Mexico. I think there are some ongoing ones in some other states as well. We're seeing a movement globally to push for maybe stricter restrictions on whether or not young people can have social media accounts, actually banning social media for people under the age of 16 and things like that. We just talked about the push for AI in the classroom, but a lot of schools are going in the opposite direction because they've seen the harm of tech and technology on kids. And so they are going tech-free or phone-free. But you're seeing these bell-to-bell cell phone bans in schools. So you're going to see more movement in this direction, which is why I wanted to equip you with some of that evidence and research. And before I move on from that topic, if you want more, let me recommend the book, The Tech Exit by Claire Morrell. I've interviewed her here on Point of View, so if you go to the website, you can research or type in the tech exit and you'll see the link to that interview in that book. So if you are a parent or a grandparent or you know someone with kids and they are trying to navigate the tech inundated world that we're in and help their kids develop a healthy relationship with technology, you have to get this book. It's just so full of research and really gives a good playbook for parents. We're actually trying to follow the tech exit ourselves in our household, and it's been great. But I want to move on and do something towards the end of the show here in our last few minutes. Maybe we can call this the Know Why segment, because as you know, I host the Know Why podcast, which is one of the many resources that Point of View provides to listeners. And usually a new episode is uploaded every Wednesday. So I have a new episode out today, and I wanted to just share about it in a few minutes. And if it piques your interest or you think you know someone who might be interested in it, then you can go to knowwhypodcast.com and you can send them that link. But what I talked about today is understanding transhumanism. And we can actually look back through history, including at some famous authors and thinkers from the past, including some of my favorites, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, to better understand transhumanism. Now, before I go on to what I talked about in the episode, I just need to give a shout out here to Kirby Anderson because he has been writing about transhumanism for a long time. It's not a new issue, as I talk about in the podcast episode, but if you are like me, a few years ago, you probably weren't thinking about the word transhumanism very much. You maybe didn't know what that meant. But before I even really looked into this issue or started researching AI or any of that, I remember proofreading a booklet that Kirby had written on the issue of transhumanism. And that's actually how I got introduced to the issue myself. So Kirby's been talking about this for a while, Point of View has. And so again, just encouraging you that we try to equip you with what's going on in the culture. But now everyone's kind of talking about it because you have these big leaders on the cutting edge of technology, people like Elon Musk, Sam Altman, and Peter Thiel. And they are all advancing an ideology called transhumanism. So some examples, Elon Musk, of course, has the company Neuralink, which creates brain-computer interfaces or brain chips, implants that can, do things like help paraplegics actually have a little more autonomy. But he thinks that everybody should have these devices because it'll make life a lot more convenient when you can just think about a text message instead of having to type one. That's just one example. There are more extreme examples, though. There is actually a company, not to get too weird here because I know we don't have very much time to go into this, but it's real. It's called Netcomb, and I talk about it in the episode of the Know Why podcast. But what they are doing, it's a startup company, and they want to preserve human brains so that you can eventually digitize your consciousness. Now, there's a catch. You have to be euthanized first because the brain needs to be fresh. And again, this is real. And Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, which is the parent company of ChatGPT, he is one of the many people who has put down a $10,000 down payment to be able to line up for this service in the future. And he is actually, you can read quotes from him saying that he believes in his lifetime brains will begin to be digitized. Now, that all sounds very strange, I understand, but what we need to understand about this is that it's not just some, weird niche interest of a lot of these people who are very rich and leading tech companies, but if you understand the worldview of transhumanism, you realize, it's not new, it's been around for a long time. What is it about? It's about the drive to control nature. It's about the drive to conquer aging, sickness, and death. Basically things humans have been trying to do almost since the beginning of time, definitely since sin entered the world. What's really interesting, and I didn't make this connection until I read this booklet, which we actually featured on Point of View, you may remember with Julie Miller, Do You Want to Live Forever? But Tolkien was really critiquing this mindset in his Lord of the Rings writings. He writes about the rings of power, and I won't get too into the fantasy lore here in case you're not into that, but basically the race of men in Lord of the Rings, they didn't like the fact that they died. They wanted to have the same kind of immortality that the race of elves had. So all throughout Tolkien's stories, even pre-trilogy, pre-Lord of the Rings trilogy, you see the race of men trying to take advantage of these kinds of devices or being tempted by these devices that promised serial longevity, which is what Tolkien called it because it wasn't true eternal life, but it just allowed them to escape the limits of their physical body. Oh, wait a second. That sounds a lot like what transhumanists are trying to do today. In fact, let me read you a quote I found this in the booklet. Again, we've interviewed Julie Miller on this, but just to refresh, there is a transhumanist declaration. And here's a quote from it. We favor morphological freedom, the right to modify and enhance one's body, cognition, and emotions. This freedom includes the right to use or not to use techniques and technologies to extend life, preserve the self through cryonics, mind uploading, and other means, and to choose further modifications and enhancements. Well, guess what? Another wonderful author, C.S. Lewis, wrote about this kind of thing in The Abolition of Man. He said that human beings were so driven to try to conquer nature and overcome our physical limits, would be so taken by new technologies that eventually the last part of nature to conquer would be human beings ourselves. And he predicted the abolition or eradication of human beings back in the 1940s. Sounds a lot like what we just talked about with Sheri with regard to the eradication of human teachers in schools. So if you want to learn more about all of that, go to knowwhypodcast.com or find the Know Why Podcast on YouTube, and I delve deeper into that in this week's episode. But we will be back tomorrow with the Next Generation Roundtable. So many great things to discuss. I'm privileged to be hosting that tomorrow, and of course we'll have some wonderful co-hosts on as well. So I hope you tune in. Thank you to Megan for your help engineering the show and Steve for producing the show. And as always, thank you for tuning in to Point of View. Don't forget to check out the resources at pointofview.net.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.